Let's talk about the time when a group of Mexican members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints seceded from the Salt Lake City-based institution in the 1930s. It's perhaps the most fascinating story from 20th century Mormonism that doesn't get talked about enough. It was led by a charismatic figure, it was born out of a Mexican cultural resurgence, and it prompted substantial changes for the LDS institution while it was on the cusp of massive global growth. Now, the church's growth in Mexico is legendary. The nation currently claims to have 1.5 million members of the LDS Church on records, the most of any nation outside the United States. It has been a crucial hub for the LDS Church since the 1890s, but the attachment and through line that what made those numbers possible was never predetermined and was severely tested during the interwar period. So today I'd like to tell this important and often overlooked history. I'll provide some background to one of the central figures, Margarito Bautista. I'll explain the context in Mexico that prompted this nativist revolt. And then I'll survey the afterstory and how many of the legacies shaped the broader LDS institution, as well as the fact that many of those conventionistas, as they became known, made their way back into the LDS Church. Now, one of the reasons we know this story so well is a number of historians have really dug into it. Perhaps most notably, Elisa Pulido's biography of Bautista, The Spiritual Evolution of Margarito Bautista, published by Oxford University Press. And thankfully, Dr. Pulido also published a short article on this topic that I'll link to in the video description. And we also have lots of documents from the story that used to be comprised in the Museum of Mexican Mormon History in Provo, but have since been transferred to Claremont Graduate University, known as the Fernando R. and Enrique Gomez Collection. Shout out to Stephanie Griswold, a PhD student in religion at Claremont, who has helped cultivate it and is also working on a wonderful dissertation on this topic. This story needs to be told. It's fascinating. It has many legacies, and it's often overlooked. So let's dig into it. Now, the LDS institution has sent missionaries to Mexico since the 1840s and 1850s, but it really becomes a point of focus in the 1880s and 1890s due to polygamy. They envisioned setting up a Mormon colony down there as the federal government in the United States was clamping down on those practicing plural marriage. And then after the LDS Church theoretically renounces polygamy in 1890, they set up this secretive practice of people with these clandestine recommends going down to Mexico for their sealings, maybe a topic for another video. But what this does is it set up a core of these elite white Mormon colonial families who are really the foundation of the church's growth in Mexico rather than native Mexican saints. Many of these key white families, like the Romneys that Mitt Romney descends from, as well as the Pratts, who are going to play a crucial role in this story, were living there, and they often take leadership roles overseeing the Mexican Latter-day Saints who convert and join the faith. At first, the Mexican government welcomes these white colonial settlements. They wanted to grow their economic development as well as build ties with businesses, and they saw the industry brought by the Mormons as desirable, though that is going to change. And soon there is also not only going to be a tension between these white Mormon colonies and the Mexican government, but there's also going to be some tensions between the local Mexican converts and these white Mormon elites. And that's what's going to set the framework, the foundation for the tensions that result in the Third Convention. By the way, before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this kind of nerdy content where we look at the past to better understand how we got to the present, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past and the present on Wednesdays, and then I peel back the curtains on the historian's craft every Friday, talking about classic works, interviewing authors about new books and articles, and then looking at sources behind common arguments so that you can gather the tools and cultivate your own sensibility of the historian's mindset. And if you wish to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, and make this channel possible, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name, and you get to feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship. One more additional benefit that comes to members that we just started is I am now starting a periodical Mailbag Monday, where on Mondays I will do deep dives answering the questions that you provide, that you members can supply through a link that I post on YouTube. So if you are a member, make sure to go to my YouTube page, click on the posts, find where I talk about Mailbag Mondays, and go to the comments, and I have a link there, and you can ask a question. I'm going to be doing my first Mailbag Monday this next Monday. I'm really excited. There's some really great questions that have already come in, so that should be a lot of fun. And if you want more questions answered, I do a monthly live discussion the first Wednesday of every month, and this next one is going to be Wednesday, August 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time on this channel. Now, I will be answering as many questions as I can, but also be riffing on a common theme. I've done a lot of videos recently on the LDS Church continuing to wrestle with issues of racism and racial ideas, including with the idea of the Lamanites, which is a topic of today, but also with legacies after the 1978 end of the racial policy. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, August 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. I also recommend following me on my different social media platforms, especially Instagram, where I do supplemental content, and you can subscribe to my free kit newsletter, where I send out periodic broadcasts, as they call it, with links, announcements, and news, and all that good stuff. But anyways, that's too much business. Let's get back to the Mexican Third Convention. So now we need to talk about Margarito Bautista, the figure who's at the center of the story, though far from alone in telling this tale. Here's a picture of Bautista as a young man. He was born in San Miguel Atlahuaca in Mexico in 1878 to Mexican and indigenous families. He grew up Catholic but expressed a seeker's spirit, looking at many different religious groups before finally converting to Mormonism in 1901. He was initially kicked out of his house for that conversion, though eventually welcomed back in. And then he soon became ordained an elder and proved to be a very effective minister, slowly moving his way up to Salt Lake City, first serving around his hometown, then moving up to El Paso, then eventually up to Utah. He wrote about his conversion and missionary work for the church's Improvement Era magazine in 1920. Here you see the cover of that, an essay from 1920 titled A Faith Promoting Experience. Notably, look at how he identifies himself as a descendant of Father Lehi. That identity is going to be crucial to him and how he packages the idea of Mormonism for Mexican saints, and especially appropriates the Lamanite identity. Now, for those of you who may be new, the Book of Mormon alleges to tell the story of ancient Americans who were in North and South America, who are proto-Christians. Their descendants, the Lamanites, still live among the people, although the identification of who that is and where it took place is hotly contested. I've done videos on this. But Bautista is one of many who start appropriating that Lamanite identity for their own use. And when he moves to Salt Lake City, he starts studying geology, history, and theology, cultivating this Lamanite theology that places Mexican saints at the center of the gospel. He is sent back to Mexico to preach the gospel and train the Lamanites, the terms they use to do genealogy, which only lasts a couple of years, where he both became popular, but also was now on the radar of church leaders for teaching what they define as uncorrelated ideas. And the Spanish-American mission president, Ray Pratt, had to denounce Bautista in several occasions as teaching things that went beyond what the church allowed. But Bautista was undeterred. He spent the first half of the 1930s writing a 500-page book titled La Evolución de México, where he used the Book of Mormon, history, and genealogy to argue that Mexican indigenous populations were God's chosen people. He converged Lamanite identity with this resurgent Mexican nationalism at the time, and he argued that all Mexicans should convert to the LDS Church to fulfill their Lamanite mission. That might sound good to the Latter-day Saint Church, but then there are other elements where that centering went beyond what the church was comfortable with, including demanding that the United States turn over the land that they had taken from Mexico, including Utah territory. So the church, as you might imagine, refused to publish the book, and it was an omen for what came next, because soon Bautista is going to find a crowd who is receptive to this message. Now, to understand the cultural forces that propelled Bautista to this track and also prepared many other Mexican Latter-day Saints to embrace his message, we need to understand a little bit about Mexico's revolutions in the early 20th century, primarily how they were a rebellion against the white colonial elites, both the Spanish and the United States. It was a push for indigenismo, or a Mexican indigenous identity that argued for local autonomous control rather than relying on these white or European elites performing governance over them. And this, of course, culminates in the 1917 Constitution, which becomes a potent text for not just the Mexican nation, but Mexican Latter-day Saints. The 1917 Constitution had clear anti-clerical provisions that tried to place churches in control of the local members. And you could see why it was a threat, because the Catholic Church tried to push back to get their members to overturn these provisions that were going to turn over the keys, the land, the authority to local Mexican members rather than allow it be controlled by a foreign hierarchy. The Constitution insisted that foreign-led companies, just like churches, had to be expropriated, nationalized, and turned over to the leadership of Mexican citizens, and land had to be held by native landholders. Now, at first, Mexican Latter-day Saints hoped the church would follow suit. They embraced these broader changes, and they believed the church would be able to fit in. The church taught that the Lamanites were the chosen people, after all, so why not give them control? They also took heart that, at least at first, the LDS Church did not seem to push back like the Catholic Church did. And so they held two conventions in 1931 and at some point in the ensuing months before spring of 1932 that requested the church to appoint a native-born Mexican mission president. These petitions, the first and second convention, were offered by believers and were meant to bring the church in harmony with national law. But the church ignored both petitions. And by 1936, these Mexican saints were growing impatient with the church's refusal to accommodate these new nationalist beliefs and moderate according to the law, just when the nation was also trying to enforce these anti-clerical measures, which is what set the groundwork for when Bautista returns back to Mexico with his mission of indigenous Mexican control. So Bautista returns back to Mexico after writing La Evolución de México, after the church refused to publish the manuscript, and now he is ready to kind of separate those ties. Here he is, a picture of him as an older man. His manuscript was now embraced by many Mexican Latter-day Saints who wanted to capitalize on it just when the church was announcing the creation of a new Mexico mission, separating it from what had been the Spanish-American mission. Yet their hopes were dashed in April 1936, when the church, instead of appointing a local indigenous Mexican saint, appointed Harold Pratt, who represented this elite Mormon family, the Pratts, who he was a Mexican citizen, but not an indigenous Mexican saint. Although it should be noted that Harold Pratt was sympathetic to their causes, and it didn't seem like he initially rejected them. So on April 21st, 1936, around 120 Mexican saints met in Mexico City. They called the gathering the Third Convention. Third in succession on top of the two conventions took place. They also became known as the Conventionistas. They nominated Bautista to be their new mission president, but he declined, so they instead nominated as their new mission president over the Mexican Mormon mission, Bautista's nephew, Abel Paez. Now, notably, Harold Pratt even agreed to deliver a set of petitions from these conventionistas to Salt Lake City. So it seems like he was willing to work with them. But these grievances and these petitions that came from Bautista, that Bautista primarily authored with the support of the other members, was deemed as too much. It was mostly patterned after the Mexican 1917 Constitution, what I spoke about. It emphasized three themes: the ethnic difference and prejudice, the Mexican law that the church must follow, and the development development of Mexican autonomy, that the Mexican Latter-day Saints should be allowed to be in control, to follow the law, and exercise their God-given divine chosen status. To give you a taste of the types of things they argued, here are a couple quotes. First, quote, "We are convinced that the ideology of the Mexican has not been understood by white people, nor by our brothers that have presided over us. We are convinced that our good and bad tendencies are completely different than those of any other nation." So you see this idea of autonomy and difference. Now that I'm recording this video on the 250th anniversary of the United States, you can see similarities in arguing for local differences being enough to justify an autonomous relationship. Here's a second quote. Quote, "That white people have a tendency to subjugate us in one condition or another is positively the case, an act it would seem that neither they nor we could avoid. We are already convinced that the supremacy of the white people is, so to speak, a gift, and that humiliation on our part has apparently been constituted a duty." In other words, they recognize that this racial inequality was firmly in place and would not be overturned unless a major reorienting of how the church was structured. Now, I want to emphasize that those who are making these petitions, these Third Convention members, were doing so because they were devout believers. They weren't skeptics. They weren't critics. They were wanting to fulfill what they saw as the divine promises of the Book of Mormon. And they were also trying to get the church to follow Mexican law. Unfortunately, the petition was not as well received as they hoped it would be. Because in the First Presidency at the time when the petition arrived was J. Reuben Clark. He had been added to the First Presidency a few years before, and he had previously been the United States ambassador to Mexico, where he was known for opposing this Mexican nationalist upsurge. And so the church probably wouldn't have been interested in accommodating these requests in general. But J. Reuben Clark in particular was not interested in allowing this indigenous uprising. And so he and Heber J. Grant and David O. McKay rejected Bautista's Lamanite theology that was at the heart of this petition. They argued that Bautista's work now had to be suppressed, and they excommunicated Bautista, Paez, and the other leaders of the Third Convention. As a result, over almost a third of the church's 3,000 members left the church and founded their own organization. Among the great documents and photographs that are contained at the Gomez collection at Claremont is this one from one of the baptismal services among the Third Convention denomination. Now, a splinter group led by people like Bautista and also Paez, who are arguing that they are God's truly called saints, and they are establishing and fulfilling the promises of the Book of Mormon. But again, this schism, this breakoff group, does not end up lasting as long as they had expected, or frankly, as long as the LDS Church may have feared. Because within a year, Bautista has lots of conflicts with the other Third Convention leaders. Bautista tried to introduce some of his more radical ideas and doctrines beyond the Lamanite chosen status. Doctrines like polygamy and united order. Remember, he learned Mormonism from some of these post-manifesto communities in the Mormon colonies in Mexico, and he came to believe that polygamy was true. Other Mexican saints did not fully agree, so Bautista was expelled by the end of 1937. Now, Bautista would go on to form his own group, the Nueva Jerusalem, that was small, and many thought it had died out. However, it has been discovered to survive. This is a really fun story. Thomas Murphy, an excellent Mormon anthropologist who has a great book that came out on unsettling scripture earlier this year that I talked about on my Instagram channel, discovered in 1996 that there were still about 800 people living in a settlement that directly descended from the Nueva Jerusalem led by Bautista. I'll link to his article in the video description, and I'll highlight the article at the end of this video. And with Bautista gone, the remaining Third Convention saints were a bit more amenable to eventually work their way back to the church. And by 1946, a decade later, after the Third Convention schism, most of those conventionistas were readmitted to the LDS Church. This was performed both by the diplomatic work of the LDS mission president R. Well Pierce, as well as concessions done by Abel Paez. Remember, he was the guy they pushed for their new Mexican mission president. This also caused the church to adapt and change as a result. It was not just concessions from the Mexican saints, but it was concessions from the LDS Church. The LDS Church was still going to maintain firm control. They were going to decide mission presence and so forth. But they learned that they had to grant a bit more autonomy and freedom to local preferences and culture. In other words, they have to allow the Mexican saints to act like Mexican saints, which is going to lay the foundation for the church's massive growth across the globe in the ensuing decades after World War II. In other words, the lessons that they learned from the Third Convention, what the institution did wrong, and how they can better accommodate them, allowed the church to grow in similarly unique congregations throughout the globe. In other words, the modern origins of the global LDS Church. I told you this was a fascinating story, and I hope it lived up to it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, share the video, become a member if you want to give back. And if you want to learn more about this story, I have some reading suggestions for you. First, and most importantly, is Elisa Eastwood Polito's book, The Spiritual Evolution of Margarito Bautista, published by Oxford University Press. But if you don't want to buy the book, she also wrote an excellent article that surveys the Third Convention that was published in the Mormon Studies Review when I was the editor that you can read online for free. It's titled Margarito Bautista, Mexican Politics and the Third Convention. I'll link to it in the video description. If you want the broader story of Mormons in Mexico, there's a wonderful, I could highlight a number of great books, including some by Lamont Tullis, but I want to highlight a collection of edited chapters that I continually return to because each chapter is filled with fascinating ideas. It's a volume edited by Jason Dormady and Jared Tamez titled Just South of Zion, The Mormons in Mexico and Its Borderlands, which includes a chapter on the Third Convention. If you are interested in Mormons in Mexico, this is a great book to start. And if you want to learn more about this remnant from Bautista's communal group, you can read Thomas Murphy's article, Stronger Than Ever, Remnants of the Third Convention. Again, linked to in the video description. I love these types of stories because it takes our focus away from Salt Lake City. It emphasizes the groundswell, the bottom-up type of history that ends up changing the institution, and it gives us some background to how the LDS global institution came to be that could not be understood without these local Latter-day Saints in Mexico in this case. Anyways, I hope you found this video useful. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it allows us to not just capture these fascinating tales, but see how they connect to the modern world in which we now live.